27.
It's March 27, Ukraine Media Center Current Forum starts its operation. My name is Svetlana Cheparenko, and now we will be having a presentation of the analytic report Forcing of Russian Citizenship on Ukrainians in Occupied Ukrainian Territories and Russian Federation. The report was prepared by the experts of Ukraine 5 AM Coalition. So let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today in our studio are Olha Lototska-Kolesnichenko, documentarian of the Ukraine 5 AM Coalition, Oleh Kolesnichenko, documentarian of the Ukraine 5 AM Coalition, Kateryna Rashevska, expert at the Regional Center for Human Rights, and joining us online will be Lyubov Smachylo, analyst of the Media Initiative for Human Rights. So, Ms. Olga, first I would like to ask you to tell us about the main conclusions of the report you're presenting today, and what are the methods that the enemy is using for forcible passportization of Ukrainian population in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Thank you for your question. Well, the main conclusions that we've done after we started gathering the materials using different techniques within half a year and until this moment that we've finalized the report that we're presenting now, the main conclusions are as follows. The first of them is that starting with the year 1992, that's one date, and another is the moment when the incumbent president of Russian Federation came into office. So basically from that period, Russian Federation views their passport, their citizenship, not in a way that the majority of the civilized countries do, but as a weapon of expansion, and it can be clearly traced. You can read it in our report. You can trace it through Russian legislation, and it becomes clear that Russia is interested about two things. First is to provide the citizenship to the most number of the citizens of post-Soviet territory that they see as their sphere of influence, like the citizens of Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Kazakhstan. And yet another thing stipulated by Russian legislation, they have the mechanisms of expansion clearly set forth in their legislation. So basically they describe the mechanisms of provision of Russian citizenship in those parts of the world that are joining Russian Federation. So those are the conclusions we came up with after tracing the Russian legislation starting from year 1992 and ending with that legislation that is in effect for the time being and in compliance with which in temporarily occupied territories the forcible passportization of the citizens of those territories is going on. So how is this passportization going? What exactly are the methods used by Russian Federation? Are those methods unique? Because you've mentioned that Ukraine is not the first country where such activities are being conducted. Do the Russian Federation, Russians spread their experience over the newly occupied territories of Ukraine? Thank you for reminding me about that. Basically, all of the armed conflicts that were waged by Russian Federation in the territories of the former USSR, I mean, with exclusion for Chechen Republic, but I mean Moldova and Georgia. So all the conflicts that were started by Russian Federation were preceded by passportization, specifically in those regions which Russians wanted to segregate from their countries or separate. In the same way, we were able to find the evidences in the mass media of those cases when, for example, in the 90s, forcible passportization was going on in Crimea when people were offered an insert to be added to their Ukrainian passport that in fact was an evidence of their Russian citizenship. And talking about the techniques used for passportization, usually the methods used in occupied territories is the force and pressure. And maybe Mr. Oleh can give us more detail using the example of a number of regions. So talking about the passportization, first, using the example of Russian Federation, we see quite a unique phenomena when legal and actual activities of the occupational administrations are going on in the court, not with the situation, but propaganda narrative. So basically what was going on in the first half of year 2022 was aimed at supporting the propaganda narrative that all of the inhabitants of the temporarily occupied territories wish to become Russian citizens, and they get Russian passports in a voluntary manner, but it resulted in quite an intense resistance, and according to the information available to us, people were loath actually to receive the passports voluntarily, because many of those who wanted to become Russians, they acquired Russian passports through the mechanisms that were existed before the full-scale invasion. For example, among the soldiers of the Russian occupation army, there are evidences that there are people from Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Odessa were coming to DPR, getting Russian passports, and now they're fighting on the enemy's side. But during the occupation, they didn't make it achieving their results in a voluntary manner. There were like stage presentations where Salda and Valitsky were getting passports with a couple of dozens of those who wanted to get them too, but there is no like thousandfold wave as they announced. So after the signature of the laws to have the occupied territories of Ukraine join Russian Federation, the methods of whip and gingerbread, so the gingerbread was wrapped up and there was only whip remaining there. And talking about the occupied part of the Zaporizhia region, the first occupational administrations and all of those who were collaborating voluntarily, they were vested 90s years type authorities, and Russian puppet masters were only demanding them to have 80% of population forcibly passportized. So it's different region to region, but what's common about them is the pressure, limitation of basic necessities, basic disbursements, basic limitation of basic rights, including right to movement, right to medical aid, emergency medical aid, education for the children. So basically it all ends up in omnipresent terror supported by media in Zaporizhia region. There were forced deportation of people. People were sent in the direction of the front lines for just being relatives of those who cooperated with armed forces of Ukraine. Well, the then mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, mentioned that 12 people got into safety in Zaporizhia, but where are the rest of those people gone? Nobody knows. There was information about them digging trenches for the Russians in the front lines. Ms. Olga, you have anything to add? I would like to give you just a simple example that we were frequently using as we were working on preparation of this report in conversation among us to explain what passportization in temporarily occupied territories looks like, what the people are facing in a complex way. So let's just imagine, like you wake up in the morning and you wake up in a different country with different laws, different bureaucracy, and you have your job, your business, you got your real estate, you have your kids attending school, you have your relatives, ties with whom are confirmed with some paperwork. So you're waking up in a different country and you're not alone, like number of people like you is huge, and there is a country that knows that there are people living in their territory and they don't have any documents that would confirm their citizenship, and this country is bringing you in compliance with your democratic rights, or like bringing in compliance with their legislation, violating your democratic rights, and now you have to provide paperwork to confirm that your car is your car, your real estate is your real estate, your husband or wife is your husband and wife, your kids are yours, and so on and so forth. So this is exactly how this is happening, plus the fear of violence, psychological pressure, and all those specifics that we know about in the occupied territories. So basically, this is the situation that Russia puts people in occupied territories, exercising pressure over them to forcibly receive Russian passport. So even if a person wants to leave, there are multiple cases when leaving temporarily occupied territories without Russian passport is just impossible. We are aware of terrible story when people were not able to get evacuated from Oleshki. Russian military stopped them at the checkpost, and under those premises that they didn't have Russian passport, they forced them to stay in Oleshki after the detonation of Kakhovka Dam, after the flooding. So this is the metaphor, this is the description of the situation in occupied territories that we were using as we were preparing the report and studying all that massive of information about what's going on in temporarily occupied territories, how this forcible passportization is going on. Well, it's a very clear example. Thank you very much. I would like to continue about the methods of passportization. Mr. Oleh has mentioned about the narratives spread by Russian Federation. I would like to ask a technical team to have Ms. Lyubov join us and tell us how the aggressor, the Russian Federation, how do they use media and other channels of communication to force the citizens of Ukraine staying in temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine to be forcibly passportized. Good afternoon. Well, really, those propaganda messages about Russian Federation and about the necessity to get Russian passports, they do exist, but I would like to give you some more examples of conditions in which people are forced to receive those passports. So for example, it's when the citizens in occupied territories don't have access to very basic medical services, for example, to insulin or some emergency medical aid, in case they don't have some special insurance policy that can be obtained only in presence of Russian passport. Or the students in the high school, they are being told that they won't be able to study in the higher educational institutions if they don't get Russian passports. So those are the very basic things that, like, their rights which are limited for the people in case they don't get Russian passports. So as we were analyzing it all, we've realized that we don't have access to occupied territories, and we were analyzing a lot of information from the open sources, specifically from those media, press, Telegram channels that exist in temporarily occupied territories, so basically the Russian ones. And we were seeing the way they were showing how good the passportization process goes, that a part of the temporarily occupied territories, like almost all of those citizens, they have Russian passports, and thus they create the picture when everything is like great, so come and get Russian passport and you're gonna have access to all those basic rights. Thank you very much, Ms. Kateryna, Mr. Oleh. Also, I would like to add about the narratives. It's important for the people to know Because as you analyze anything related to Russians, you have to understand that there are words and there are actions, there are internal and external messages. So as their administration states that they've issued 4 million passports in Donbass, however, we see that we know for sure it had not happened. Because in their internal media, there are complaints that passport center can issue only 25% per day. There are no blank forms, whereas people just cannot get to those passport offices because people with Ukrainian passports cannot get through the checkposts. So we have to understand that what they say through big media is just supporting the picture of their narrative, but what's going on in reality, we can see it even in the open sources, or like even through their legislation, like Lyubov has mentioned, the insurance policy, the right to emergency medical aid in the temporarily occupied territories without the medical insurance policy. The medical insurance policy is like a similar to our family doctors and declarations. So they've extended this opportunity to get medical aid without those policies for the years 23 and then 24. And at the same time, there were statements by their Ministry of Interior in December that the passportization is over. There are only a couple of thousand people left without passports, but still we see that they continue using the same instruments that they were using for the pressure. They extended their effect, thus indicating that there is such a huge number of people without passports who won't be able to like normally live, that would result in very undesirable effects. So what their central authorities and their media say are whole different things from what's going on in reality. Thank you very much. Ms. Kateryna, I would like to discuss the legal side of this question. People in temporarily occupied territories ended up in a very difficult situation because not getting a passport is like means to refuse all the social guarantees, benefits, services, and so on and so forth. But getting a passport is putting yourself in legal jeopardy in future because that document has no legal force, the so-called passport. So how can we evaluate this forced passportization from the point of view of international law? And how does the Ukrainian legislation views those people who take Russian passports? Well, Russian Federation, in fact, they realized the trap plan, so to say, because as soon as you get Russian passports, it does not guarantee that you are in a condition of a relative safety and you're entitled to all those guarantees, because Russian passport is not about the rights. Russian passport is about obligations, and it's about implementation by Russian Federation of their own national interests. So basically in this issue, they copy the policy of Germanization of occupied territories that was exercised by Nazi Germany during World War II, and then the imposition of citizenship was not about providing guarantees in the same way as it's happening now, but it's about using this narrative about desire to become a part of Great Russia. It's for the annexation of temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. That's one strategic goal. And another is to use the demographic resource in the occupied territories for their own benefit. And we're obviously talking about forced mobilization, first of all, because that's yet another separate war crime, and also it's about use of Ukrainian citizens as a labor force, as a workforce. So basically the same thing that was happening in Nazi Germany during World War II. Also, I would like to mention that in fact, even before the full-scale invasion, back in 2021, in the end of the year, so-called President Putin came up with a legislative initiative to amend the federal law on citizenship. And back then, if we analyze that draft law in detail, we could clearly see their intentions to capture as much territory of Ukraine as possible, to issue those passports, and then to use it as leverage both the absence and presence of Russian citizenship for the sake of persecution in the temporarily occupied territories. So based on what my colleagues have said, we see that they kind of making it, talking about the legal aspects, even before the beginning of the World War II, back in 30th century 20, it was clear in international law that the discretion to impose your citizenship in the territory of a sovereign country is absolutely limited, so those activities, they can be construed as violation of principles of sovereignty and sovereign equality of sovereign states and lack non-intrusion into affairs of the state. So thus Russia is violating the principles of UN statute, and Russia somehow continues to be a global policeman there, violating the fundamental rules of the document, of this fundamental document, and violation of the fundamental laws of fundamental international law. It means the principle of anti-belligerence. So basically, the citizenship does not allow you to return to the previous status that existed before occupation. So as I've mentioned, it's about their obligation of the citizens, violation of their rights, and obligation to swear allegiance to aggressive state. That's yet another violation of international humanitarian law. And talking about the violation of human rights, depending on the situation, there's a huge bouquet of those violations, like the right of preserving the national identity, and ending with all the violations that I've mentioned, including the deportation to the territory of Russian Federation or Belarus. And in this context, I would like to focus, because the colleagues mentioned a lot of cases that I appreciate, but we have not mentioned the vulnerable categories in terms of imposition of Russian citizenship. I cannot help but mention the children of specific status, those who were deprived of fostering by parents, or the orphans. So it doesn't matter whether the children live in a foster home or with foster parents, they are the target audience for imposition of citizenship. And when such citizenship is being forced, such family or such kid, if they end up in an institution, they are under full control of the aggressor state, or their foster kids, they have an obligation to raise a kid as a citizenship of Russian Federation, to send them to an educational institution to study under the Russian program or Russian curriculum. And what Ms. Lyubov has mentioned, it's not only impossible to continue the education in higher educational institution, but on top of that, you cannot get the graduation certificate from the high school. So this is what Russia manipulates with. This is what they were doing in temporarily occupied Crimea, even before the full-scale invasion, by the way. And from the point of view of the orphans and children deprived of foster rights, so imposition of citizenship is the way to expedite the process of their deportation and eradication of their identity. In our Regional Center for Human Rights and with our partners from Lemkiv Institute, we've analyzed the situation and submitted the relevant case to International Criminal Court. And I would like to highlight that we see a positive dynamics in the international level when one by one, both monitoring mission of UN and International Commission for UN on human rights, they start talking about those violations of human rights. Another category of population are the people who were staying in confinement institutions, the prisoners basically. And I'm not even talking about political prisoners, we talk about just ordinary prisoners who refusing the Russian citizenship, basically force themselves to stay in prison for infinite term. Let me give you an example. You stay in the prison in temporarily occupied territory, and then Russian Federation wants to use this prison for forced abductions, and including with a political goal. They think that you are supposed to be deported somewhere to other guests, so you are being deported without your consent, which is a war crime. And now your sentence expired, even in compliance with the Russian law, but you cannot get to Ukraine because your Ukrainian passport is not effective because you're like 45 years old. You were not able to comply with the rules on changing your picture. I'm talking about the real case. I'm talking about the real story. And within an infinite term, you're staying in a confinement center in Russian Federation without any opportunity to come back. Is it a case of a random detention? Yes, it is. And I hope that the new Moscow mechanism that deals with civilian prisoners, civilian hostages, it will pay attention to this category of people too. Also, we need to talk about the adults who were staying in some institutions due to their health conditions. So there are whole categories of people who just cannot do anything with the discretion of Russian Federation in terms of forcing the citizenship. So to sum it up, I have to state that occupation is a temporary phenomena. I'm reminding it to Russian Federation and other authoritarian states. So no passportization is acceptable there, specifically in case this passportization has a forced nature. And by its nature, in my opinion as a lawyer, those activities should be classified as crime against humanity that I hope we are about to see in the opinions of the experts of international organizations. But for Ukrainian legislation, are those people with double citizenship, or we don't view the Russian passport as document itself? Well, I have to highlight it. Both in Ukraine and Russian Federation, which unlike Ukraine, keep saying that they recognize dual citizenship. So all those citizens are considered the Ukrainian citizens exclusively. Ukraine does not recognize the forced Russian citizenship. And now that I've mentioned Russian Federation, even regardless of the fact that they have Article 10 in the federal law on citizenship that describes the dual citizenship, but due to the fact that there is no agreement on recognition of dual citizenship between Ukraine and Russia, so Ukraine does not recognize those citizens as Russian citizens and only as Ukrainian citizens, and Russia does quite the opposite. Yet another thing I want to mention, that if a person gets Russian passports under pressure to be able to exercise their fundamental rights and freedoms, they will never be liable for such activities on national level, on the level of national legislation. But at the same time, if a person accepts Russian passport and they support Russian Federation in any way as an aggressor state, like, for example, let's be clear, and let's talk about cases. For example, they were organizing the elections of Putin in organized territory, they were agitating. So all those activities can be, or they were promoting it, so all those activities fall under the violation of Ukrainian legislation. So Ms. Vereshchuk, Mr. Lyubov were emphasizing that the fact of presence of Russian passport that was forced on a person does not entail any legal liability. Thank you very much. I would like to offer our journalists join our conversation. So your questions, please. Oleh Shershin, Ukrinform. Do we know what is the number of Ukrainian citizens who accepted Russian passports, or the Ukrainian authorities think that they got Russian passports? Well, thank you for your question. It's quite a problematic question, you know, because in accordance with the international law, there is occupation going on there. There are still battle operations going on. The territory is under control of the military, and no information, no faithful information is available to either party. So any statements both by us or by them can be better viewed as propaganda, because both parties are waging a war. Propaganda is an element of battle operations. So, for example, in Zaporizhia region, to say what is the number of people remaining there given the period is going on, because if we check the statements by the both Ukrainian and Russian officials, the number the amount of population there was about 500,000, and we see that there's a lot of people who left to the territory under Ukrainian control. This is why stating some specific figure is very difficult. And the same story is with Donetsk and Luhansk region, because from the point of view of Russians, they just had as much passports issued as was the amount of population before the invasion in all of the region, not only the particular regions of Donetsk and Luhansk region, but we know they have no control of the Donetsk region. And on top of that, the number of internally displaced persons starting from the year 2014, well, we know at least the Ukrainian numbers. So basically, there is no faithful information about that. We can give some approximate numbers. I can tell you for sure that there are some vulnerable categories of population remaining there, like the elderly, the prisoners, the children, the orphans, who were not able to live for sure. Well, or like, for example, people with disabilities, or people who were staying in the institutions. So in fact, we cannot get any specific figures from there. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions on the floor? Good afternoon, Dmitro Didora, Espresso TV channel. Look, we're talking about passportization, and it's bad when Russia does so. It's a crime, really. But people who have already accepted the passports, but still they want to leave the temporarily occupied territories, maybe Ms. Kateryna may answer. Is there a legal mechanism to properly leave the occupied territory, how to get to a European country or to get back to Ukraine through European country? What should they do? Should they show Russian passport in Russian Ukrainian border and then produce Ukrainian passport in another border? So what should well, you know, it would be cool if we have one universal pill, one mechanism how to leave the occupied territory. It would help us to return all of our citizens back to Ukraine, or at least we would have them as refugees in Europe and other foreign countries. So unfortunately, there are cases when, yes, it's easier to produce Russian passport in Russian border, or there are people who didn't get Russian passport, or they have a like residence permit, temporary residence permit, which helps them to leave temporarily occupied territories. So there are cases when people leave for Russia or are being deported, and then they want to leave the aggressor territory through the third country. They sometimes demonstrate, and some Baltic countries were even allowing to show the expired documents that lost their legal force. Well, basically, there were initiatives to try for some categories of population who were affected by Russian aggression to get some documents from International Criminal, oh sorry, it's my professional information, International Committee of Red Cross, to leave that territory. So there are different mechanisms that work in different ways, different checkposts through which temporarily occupied territory and territory of Russian Federation operate in a different manner. It's not even safe to tell about the way that some people leave this territory, for example, like Ukrainian children, because it's always a specific operation, and disclosure of any data may be of harm to them. So there is no universal pill, and in the same way, there is no guarantee that a person who shows a Russian passport to a Russian FSB officer, for example, a man of conscription age, so there is no guarantee they can leave the territory rather than to be mobilized and sent to the front lines. Well, and I would like to add that, as Ms. Kateryna has mentioned, the Russian human rights people, they use such a term as toxic asset. Like, so for now, the passport offices, they are prohibited to issue foreign passports for a person for men of the conscription age. So basically, if you get a Russian passport, you are locked inside Russian territory. So as soon as you get Russian passport, your first contact with during your first contact with the migration service, this passport will be seized and preserved. So for the men, the best way to leave the occupied territory is to keep the Ukrainian documents, Ukrainian ID. Thank you very much. Now that we don't have any more questions on the floor, let me remind you, we were talking about the imposition of Russian citizenship on Ukrainian citizens in temporarily occupied territories, and we will be back on air at 13:30 and talk about corruption. Stay tuned.